All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about this concept of box modeling. When you look at your website is nothing but a bunch of structured boxes. And sometimes those boxes are nested within other boxes. So we're going to talk about some of the different CSS properties that we can use, that we can apply to a particular box model. So here's a good visual where you'll see that there's a number of different CSS properties. There's margin, there's border, and there's padding that we can apply to a particular box. And then there's width and height. There's width that we can get that basically gives us the width of the content, but the true total width of this box element will include all of the active white space that the margin, the border, and the padding applies to this box element. This next visual kind of help us see that a little bit better, where we have some lower ipsum text here, and that's the content width. And there's a property that we'll use in CSS called width. And that will measure out to only measure the content. But the total width of this box element includes not only the content, but also the margin, the border, and the padding. And so we'll play around with adding some of these CSS properties here in just a second. But let me say a few more things about a box model. All right. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, your website is nothing but a bunch of boxes nested within boxes. And our job here is to give each of those boxes presentation. So we can give it border, we can give it margin, we can give it padding. More specifically, margin and padding is going to be gives our box element something called active white space. We can give active white space to certain parts of our box element, and that's what this diagram is showing here, is that we can give only a side of our box element border. And so in this case here, it's given a border left, 6 pixels. And then here to the left is given padding left, which is the active white space within the box element. And then margin top 3 em, which is the active white space outside of the box element. So let's play around with this. And I think that's going to give us a better idea of how to structure our boxes within our website. And we're going to do this activity part A. Now in class, we're going to do activity part B. And so if you get when you get a chance here, after we do activity A, go ahead and take a stab at activity part B. But first, let me give you the solution to activity part A. So we're going to copy this code here, and we're going to basically accomplish the 2 bullet points that we see here. And you'll see within this activity, we're going to create 3 box elements, the div, these 3 div elements, number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then begin to apply some CSS properties. All right, so let's go and pull up our editor here. And what I'm going to do is remove some of the code that we have from our previous video, and I'll just paste in the code from this activity. And I'll add in our CSS internally here. So I'll say style. So I'm opening and closing style tag. And so the first bullet point here is that it wants us to create 3 boxes with a width and height of 250 pixels. Before I begin to apply some CSS properties here, here's a good site. Mozilla, they have a lot of good documentation around HTML and CSS. And so if you just Google Mozilla CSS box modeling, you'll come up, it'll be one of the first links within Google. But the reason I show you this site here is because here's some different properties that you would potentially use when you're beginning to structure out a box element or a box within your website. So you may use height, margin, right? The max and min properties, and then there's padding. And so, and then each one of these give a good description. And then there's something called margin trim, which is a new CSS property that's an experiment. So it may not be implemented in all browsers at this moment, but in an experimental phase. So anyway, let's go back to our site, and we're going to give each one of these boxes a width and a height. Now the question is, how do I target each of these boxes? I could say div, and that would target every div in my web page. But in this case here, I want to be a little bit more specific here and target only specifically these 3 elements. And this is a process called keeping your tags clean, because if I wanted to use div somewhere else on my web page, it's going to apply every CSS declaration that I give this div. But in this case here, I'm going to only target these 3 box elements. And what I'm going to do is add what we call a class attribute. And why do I add class? It's because class you can apply the class attribute to multiple elements within your web page. Now to say boxes, and I'll add that class attribute to each one of these. And I didn't want to use ID here. Reason being is because ID it's meant to only be used for one element within your web page. And so here, if I want to target each element that has the class attribute, I'll just say dot. Dot signifies the class attribute, boxes. And then here, I'll give a width attribute of 250 pixels and a height attribute of 250 pixels, and save that. And let's see what else it's having me do here. It wants us to apply a border radius of 14 pixels for each box, and so the border radius here and the border radius gives around the curvature edges to your box elements, and you'll see the look and feel of that in just a second here. And the next thing here, it wants us to apply a border that is 10 pixels solid in the color 333. So it's going to do that. Or 10 pixels, I think it said. And the next one here is apply 12 pixels of active white space around each box and float the boxes next to one another. And so 12 pixels of active white space around each box element, and that's going to be, which property would you use for that? And that's going to be active white space outside of the box element, and that's going to be margin. So in this case here, we'll go back to our code and we'll say margin. And this is a shorthand property. And then we'll say, I think, what was the value there? It was 12 pixels. Let's go and save that and see what we have thus far. And so we'll right click, go back to our browser here, and we'll refresh. This is what we currently have, is these three box elements. It has a border of 10 pixels. And there's some active white space around these boxes. How do I know there's active white space? Obviously because the boxes are not touching. But if I go and hover over this box in my HTML, you'll see that specifically for box 2 here, the orange space around it is the active white space. Again, margin is the active white space outside of the box element, and then padding is the active white space within the box element. Let's go and finish this activity. I want us to float these boxes next to one another. And we're going to say a lot more about the float property and what that does here. But the float property takes these box elements out of their normal flow. The best way to illustrate this here would be to, if I right click and I inspect this here, watch what happens when I put the float property in. I want to say float, and I'll just say float left. Right? Everybody see that? Again, I'll take it off and I'll say left. And it takes it out of the normal flow. The normal flow is that the box elements stack on top of one another. When I begin to float them, it's almost like a water in bubbles. They float up to the next available, wherever there's available space. And so I'll save that and finish off this activity by doing number 2 here. So it's going to first paste that into our source code. Let's save it. And let's bring up our next activity here. And the last thing it wants us to do is apply a background color of this hexadecimal color code and a font family of Arial and a font weight of bolder. All right. So here we're going to say a background color of this hexadecimal, and then it wants us to apply a font weight of bolder. And the last thing I believe it mentioned was that it wants us to add a font family of Arial. So I'll just copy that quickly here. And that's it for this activity. But here are some of the different properties that we use: with height, border, margin. Again, margin is the active white space outside of the box element, and padding is the white space within the box element. And so in the next activity, I want you guys to take a stab at adding padding to go to take a step back, activity part B, but then it's going to have you add padding to these box elements. A few more things here before I end this video. When you look at these boxes here, we apply margin, and margin is what we consider a shorthand property. But we could, if we wanted to, say 12 pixels and say 20 pixels. If we were in a, if you were taking an in-person class session with me, I would ask the question of how does that apply to the box elements if you gave it two values such as 12 pixels and 20 pixels. The short answer is that if you use the shorthand property margin, if you give it two values, the first value applies to the top and bottom. It's going to give it 12 pixels, and then the 20 is going to apply to the left and the right of the box element. If you give this element four values, let's say 12 pixels, 10 pixels, 30 pixels, and 40, or let's say 5 pixels, how does this apply? Essentially, this applies clockwise: top, right, bottom, and then left. So the left would have 5 pixels, the bottom would have 30 pixels, the right side of that box would have 10 pixels, and the top would have 12 pixels. And the same thing could be said for padding, and the same thing for so the same thing for margin and padding. You can essentially apply the active white space in a clockwise manner if each of those sides needed different measurements. So here, let's go ahead and put it back to 12 because that's what the activity was asking for. But I would say go ahead and take a stab at activity part B and see if you can accomplish these 3 bullet points here. And then in our next video, we're going to talk about our first layout approach, and that's going to be the traditional float layout. And I would say you have to have a good grasp on box modeling because we're going to essentially be taking these 3 different box models and the things that we learned in box modeling and beginning to do a basic, one of the more older ways of doing layout is using float and positioning property. Using the float, the width, the height, and a new property called the clear. It's not new, but new to us in this idea of learning CSS layout. So go ahead and take a step at activity B here, and then we'll take a look at it when we're in person or when we're doing our synchronous session. And in our next video, we'll talk about traditional float layout.